Hey, it's Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader. Welcome to the Black Belt Leadership Podcast, where each week I'm giving you tips, tools, insights, and resources to help you become a better version of who you are and what you do as you discover, develop, and deploy your own Black Belt leader within. Hey, this week I want to talk about the Tower of Babel, but I want to share an untold story you perhaps may not know. Now, if you're a person of faith and you're familiar with the Torah or the Christian Bible, both of those scriptures include the ancient story of the Tower of Babel. Now, the building of this legendary tower occurred several decades after the biblical flood, aka Noah's Ark. Now, this flood that covered the earth, according to the Torah and the Christian Bible, lasted 371 days before Noah and his family stepped out of the ark onto dry land. They were told by God to go and replenish the earth and to multiply and to fill the earth. But ignoring the command of God to do that very thing, the great grandson of Noah, a man by the name of Nimrod, decided to settle in the land of Shinar. Today, that's what we would refer to as ancient Babylon or ancient Mesopotamia. And it was there in the land of Shinar that Nimrod established his kingdom. Now, later on, he expanded into Assyria, where he built the legendary city of Nineveh, where we get the story of Jonah and the great fish. Now, as Nimrod's kingdom began to flourish in Shinar, the population of his kingdom began to grow. And as the population grew, so did Nimrod's power and his influence. But according to the writings of Josephus, and as we research the Talmud and the Midrash, we see that Nimrod lived in constant fear of a second global flood. Now, think about it. From his early childhood, all he heard were tales of 40 consecutive days of rain that flooded the earth, and the fact that Noah and his family, the descendants of Nimrod, spent over a year confined to an ark, floating aimlessly across the globe as waters literally flooded the highest places on the earth. Now, Jewish tradition holds that Nimrod set out to build the Tower of Babel as a means to escape the wrath of a future flood. He wanted to erect a temple tall enough that in the event God decided to flood the earth again, he could climb to the top of the tower, and it was there that he and his family could remain safe and dry. So, according to Jewish tradition, Nimrod ordered the construction of the legendary Tower of Babel. But think about it. What was he doing? He was building a tower out of fear. Now, there are other historians that note that Nimrod likely had a second motivation, because to maintain his power and to maintain his influence and to be seen as a deity to the people that he led, he chose to defy God's command to go fill the earth, and he continued to concentrate his efforts on expanding his kingdom right there in the land of Shinar. Now, tradition goes on to tell us that Nimrod wanted to build the Tower of Babel as a symbol of his divine power and his divine authority. And through the use of this tower, with his wife serving as the country's religious leader, he was going to demand worship and homage of the inhabitants of Shinar. Now, again, notice Nimrod feared if the people scattered as they were commanded to do, his power and his prestige would suffer as a result. So whether he was building it out of fear of a flood or fear out of losing his power and prestige, Nimrod was building a tower out of fear. Now, if you know the story, you know what happens. God confuses the language of the people. Interesting, the word Babel literally means confusion. And when the people couldn't understand the languages the other people were speaking, they separated and went into different parts of the world and recongregated as different people groups. And in doing so, fulfilled God's command to go and fill the earth. So after this happened, Nimrod resettled in Assyria. And it was there that he expanded his reach, his influence, and his control, but he never again attempted to build another temple to the heavens. Now, interestingly enough, we find similar stories in the Hindu, in Polynesian, in Mesopotamian, in Burmese, and in Chinese cultures. In fact, in the ancient Greek culture, we find the story of the Allidae. There were two giants, Opus and Epiphanes. They tried to reach the heavens by piling Mount Ossa on top of Mount Olympus. And then they were going to pile Mount Pelion on top of Mount Ossa. Again, the goal was to build a temple to stack the mountains so high that they could literally go to intervene in Olympus before the gods could overthrow them and end their rule in the land. Once again, we see fear as a driving force of action. But let's go back to Nimrod. Now, interestingly enough, Nimrod was a direct descendant of Noah, and Noah had experienced the great flood and survived it. So growing up, again, Nimrod heard those stories from his childhood, not only about the flood, but about how God had placed a rainbow in the sky, and that was his promise to Noah and his descendants that he would never destroy the earth again by water. But even though he heard these stories throughout his childhood and into the early formative years of his life, Nimrod chose instead to ignore the second half of the story and to live in fear. So rather than looking forward, rather than considering, contemplating, and evaluating all the opportunities before him to go and to replenish and to multiply in the earth and expand his kingdom and his reach and his impact, Nimrod's attention was focused on the past. So instead of moving forward, he chose to dig in his heels and to stubbornly remain where he was. And Nimrod found himself more focused on a repeat of the past than the prospects of tomorrow. Now, earlier this year, I introduced many of you to an organization called the Oddfellows. I did that in my teaching entitled Skeletons in the Closet. You can go back and find that on my podcast channel, on my LinkedIn, or my Substack channel. Any of my social media channels, you can find that installment, Skeletons in the Closet. But a little bit about the Oddfellows I want to go back and revisit because it ties into the story of Nimrod. Now, this fraternal organization was founded in England in the 17th century and later found roots in the United States in 1819. Their guiding principles, friendship, love, and truth. Now, the Oddfellows was a charity-focused organization, but they were initially considered odd, and this likely contributed to their name because of their commitment as individuals to help those in need, even those they didn't know or had no connection to. Now, these acts of generosity included visiting the sick, relieving the distressed, and burying the dead. Now, one of the unique quirks about the Oddfellows organization is the fact that each chapter kept a skeleton, sometimes real, sometimes fake, but they kept a skeleton in their lodge and they used it as a part of their initiation rituals. Now, many of these skeletons have been found in old lodges over the years as this organization has declined in popularity, and many of these lodges, now abandoned, were being repurposed for other uses. And believe it or not, this is actually where we get the colloquial phrase where we talk about the skeletons in the closet. Now, today, that phrase has evolved to mean an embarrassing or a shameful secret from the past that we want to keep from the world. And I mean, if we really want to admit it, most of us, maybe all of us, likely have a skeleton or two in the closet, something from our past we don't want other people to know. And as a result of that, that can cause us, like Nimrod, to live our lives in fear. Now, why is that important? Because when we're focused on the past, living in fear and believing that it may repeat itself in the future, guess what? It's hard to move forward when you're living life looking in the rearview mirror. It's hard to move forward when you're constantly looking over your shoulder, looking back at the past to see if the past may be pursuing you to show back up in the future. Because when we hold on to our past hurts, our past fears, or our past anxiety, guess what? We're giving those things power and control over our lives. And we are essentially imprisoning ourselves in the past in the process. We have literally shackled ourselves to yesterday. Now, believe it or not, this is a very real problem for many people. It's a form of self-imposed imprisonment that holds us back from reaching our full potential. But sadly, if we stay focused on the past and we continue to look over our shoulder, afraid the past may repeat itself in the present, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And as a result of that, if we live our lives focused on the past, it doesn't just leave us where we are. Because when we fail to free ourselves from the chains of the past, we actually start moving backwards, and that fear of the past and chaining ourselves to yesterday can actually take us to a place that you and I don't want or don't need to go. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's pivot into the neuroscience behind living in the past and the fear and the anxiety that comes as a result of that. We know from studies in neuroscience today that when we live with fear, one of the byproducts of that is it elevates our stress levels. And when our stress levels elevate, it releases cortisol into our bodies. Now, cortisol is that fight or flight neurotransmitter that causes us to elevate our adrenaline levels and get ready to run or fight because of a perceived danger that may be before us. And here's what we know from scientific studies as we've looked at elevated stress levels over time. If we're constantly living in the fear of the past, this constant bombardment of cortisol from the elevated stress levels from living life and being chained to the past, they can literally impede our cognitive function, the ability for our brain to work properly, and it can actually impair our ability to recall memories. What happens? Our brain literally starts to slow down, and the neural pathways that connect our stored memories so that we can bring them back into the conscious begin to unravel. And if we leave this situation unchecked in our lives and we allow these stress levels to remain high over time, it can actually lead to episodic memory loss, where we have these, oh no, I can't remember moments, but it can also lead to brain shrinkage. That's right. Recent studies related to cortisol and the long-term effects of stress on the brain have revealed that high cortisol levels can increase the risk of cognitive decline and can lead to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. Now, add to that the increased risk of high blood pressure, stroke, heart disease, sleep disorders, weight gain, diabetes, and mood disorders like depression or anxiety that also come from elevated levels of stress that we can't reduce over time. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a recipe for success. Because if we fail to free ourselves from the past is going to continue to relentlessly pursue us. Now, why is that the case? Very simple. Because what we focus on expands. And what we focus on expands in our thinking. And as we think, we become. Simply put, how you and I live life is how you and I live life. Actually, let me say it this way. How you and I see life is how we live life. So if you and I see life as something to fear, we live life afraid. Well, that's a problem for all of us because guess what? We all have a past. Every single one of us. I have a past. You have a past. We all have a past. And I can promise you, every single one of us at some point in our lives have experienced regret, a past hurt, a disappointment, and we've all likely had our share of failure. I know I have. And who among us listening to the podcast or having an opportunity to read a newsletter where I'm talking about this very subject, we haven't made a bad choice in our lives? How many of us have experienced a broken relationship? Or how many of us have found ourselves at some place in our lives where we feel alone, we feel neglected, or we feel abandoned? And I'm sure there's probably some of you listening to the podcast today that have experienced verbal or physical abuse. And with that, the accompanying guilt or shame or trauma and insecurity that come from that. You know, it's sad, but life and people can sometimes be cruel. But let's go back to what I talked about a few minutes ago. If we continue to hold on to the past, those past experiences of failure, of hurt, of anxiety, of depression, of rejection, of neglect, of abandonment, all of those things that have happened in our past, and we allow our thoughts to continually dwell on them, we're going to amplify those things until they completely fill our thought life. And when all we think every single day goes through that filter of that amplified past, as we've shackled ourselves to yesterday, here's what happens. Our brain begins to overlay the past on top of the present, and it literally distorts our view of reality. We can't see today for what it is because the past continues to replay like a motion picture in our minds, distorting our view of the present. And as a result of that, this shapes how we see the world, how we respond to the world. And here's what we know. It ends up unconsciously steering us towards the very outcomes that we want so desperately to avoid. We end up expecting more of the same, and that's what we end up experiencing in our lives. That's what happens when we end up living life looking in the rearview mirror, or we end up living life with our head turned, looking back, worrying that the past is going to catch up and find us again in the future. So I want you to think about it this way. We can't outrun an enemy if we keep looking back to see if he's still chasing us. Every time we turn our head, we slow down. And at some point, that enemy from the past, from behind us, is going to catch us if we don't keep our eyes forward and running for that safe place where we can escape that pursuer. But if we keep looking over our shoulder, not only are we going to slow down, hey, it's difficult to see where we're going if our eyes are constantly looking behind us. But this is what we do when we choose to shackle ourselves to yesterday. We remain imprisoned in the past. We remain in dread and in fear of what may be lurking and coming up behind us. And as a result of that, we're unable to fully experience the present, nor can we look forward with anticipation to the future. So what does that look like? What does that feel like? Let me give you an example that maybe will paint a picture that will help you understand how heavy this burden actually is. I recently challenged a friend of mine who was struggling with letting go of the past to go with me to the grocery store. And when we got there, I handed him a 40-pound bag of dog food, and I said, do me a favor and carry this around while I shop for some groceries. Now, I walked up and down the aisles taking my time with a little hand cart, one of those little plastic hand carts, rather than a big push cart, because I wanted him to be forced to have to carry this massive weight as we walked around the store. And the longer I walked up and down the aisles, the heavier that load on his shoulder got. When I asked him to hand me an item from the shelf, guess what? He couldn't do it because it was taking both hands to control this awkward bag of dog food. And I watched as he shifted that 40-pound bag from one shoulder to the other. And then as he brought it down to his midsection and let it dangle over, and then he put it back up on one shoulder and then on the other. But after a while, as we made our way up and down the aisles of the store, he eventually had to stop and set the dog food down. When I asked him why, he said, John, the weight of this bag is simply too much to carry. Can you see the parallel? Can you see the picture I'm trying to paint of what happens when we hold on to the past? When you and I hold on to our past hurts, our past fears, and the anxiety of yesterday, it's going to eventually weigh us down so heavily, just like my friend in the grocery store, we can't move forward. Holding on to our past hurts and fears and anxieties is so mentally and physically exhausting to carry around. If we try to do that every single day of our lives, at some point, we're going to find ourselves unable to move forward. Let me give you another example. Did you know we can't pour anything into a cup that's already full? There's no room for anything else to go in. Whatever we add simply pulls and spills over the sides. So think about that as a visual as well, because if our brains are stuffed full of the regrets and the hurts and the disappointments and the failures of the past, and we've chosen to hold on to those rather than let them go, there's no room for us to be able to take in and to enjoy all that life wants to offer us today. All the opportunities, all the joy, all the pleasures, all of the things life wants to reveal to us each day, those things like water being poured into an overflowing cup are simply going to pour away, and we're not going to be able to enjoy the benefits of today. So at this point, you may be asking yourself, say, okay, John, that's a pretty depressing message that you've been sharing for the last several minutes. How do I free myself from the past? Well, let me take a few moments and let me share a couple of ideas on how you can start this process of letting go of the past, unshackling yourself from yesterday, and being able to step in today and looking forward to tomorrow. Step one. First, you and we've got to acknowledge the past. We can't play like it didn't happen because it did. And the past happened. We've got to admit it. We can't go back and change it. We've got to own what happened and admit and accept that it happened to us. Whether our part and our role in the process was passive or active, whatever our part, whatever our role was, we've got to acknowledge that as well. Now, one of the ways that we can begin to acknowledge the past is by journaling, beginning to write down what we experienced in the past. Or another way to do that is by having a conversation and talking to a trusted friend, a family member, or a trained counselor. This can allow us to give a voice to what happened in the past, to get it out of our hearts and out of our heads and into the open. And it's there that we can start the process of analyzing it and looking at it for what it truly is. And from there, beginning to analyze it and evaluate and ultimately move past it. Now, the second thing we've got to do, even as we're putting a voice to what happened, as we're having that conversation with ourselves by journaling, or we're having that conversation with someone else, a friend, a family, a coworker, a counselor, a neighbor, someone that we can trust, we've got to also learn to recognize the emotions that are connected to that hurt or to that disappointment. Now, sometimes those emotions may appear as anger or guilt or shame or sadness. Whatever those emotions are, we can't deal with the emotions, nor can we let them go from our lives until we first recognize and identify that they exist and call those emotions by name. Now, once again, this is where a trusted friend, a family member, or a trained counselor can be a valuable asset. They can provide a listening ear, but they can also provide a third-party perspective that's disconnected from the emotion that we're experiencing as a result of what we went through, and maybe give us a different perspective that helps us reframe what happened in the past. And the other thing that those friends and family members and counselors can do, they can offer us an encouraging word to help us get past it. Now, the third thing that we can do in this process, and it's an important one, you and we have to learn to practice forgiveness. Now, we have to forgive not only those who harmed us or we may perceive have harmed us in some way, but we've got to also be willing to forgive ourselves for our role, if any, in that process. Now, it's important that we forgive, because if we don't, we're holding on to that hurt and that resentment. And when we do that, we're giving that hurt and that resentment and that person that may have been involved in that, we're giving them power and control over our lives. Now, forgiveness is a conscious choice. It is an intentional choice that you and I can make to release the anger, the frustration, and the resentment that's tied to an event or tied to an individual or even tied to ourselves, and we can intentionally choose to let go of whatever it is that we're harboring within. Forgiveness is a conscious decision to move on and to move past the hurts of the past. Now, let me quickly add to that, just because we forgive doesn't mean we have to forget, nor just because we forgive doesn't mean that we're condoning an offense that may have happened. Now, remembering the offense is often necessary for genuine forgiveness. That's important, but it's true even if the offender was ourself and not another person. Sometimes the person we have to forgive for the things that happened in the past may be someone else, but sometimes the person we have to forgive is the person we look in the mirror every single day. Now, forgiveness is this. Forgiveness is choosing not to focus on what happened in the past, because we can't go back and fix it. We can't go back and undo it. Instead, it is an intentional, purposeful choice to focus on letting go and moving forward and strengthening our emotional and our physical well-being. Now, we've got to understand this. There's often a lesson in the past, and that lesson is waiting to be recognized and embraced. It's there to make us better, not bitter. And it's going through this simple three-step process that we start the journey of giving a voice to what happened, recognizing the emotions that are there, and identifying whether or not what we are feeling is true. And through a trusted friend, through a family member, through a trained counselor, working through that process so we can get ourselves to the point we can forgive another person, and even if necessary, to forgive ourselves. So rather than running away from the what ifs in life, the what could happens, and many of those are nothing more than our imaginations running on overdrive that are powered by an obsession of the past, let me share a novel idea. Rather than being shackled to yesterday, why not reframe the story? Rather than choosing to be defined by your past, why not choose instead to be prepared by your past? Let me say that again. Rather than running from your what ifs that are often nothing more than your imagination running on overdrive that's powered by an obsession with the past, why not reframe the story? Rather than choosing to be defined by your past, why not choose instead to be prepared by your past? Now, think about what I just said, because if we choose to be defined by the past, guess what? You and I, we are admitting that we are nothing more than our past mistakes, our past failures, our past regrets, our past disappointments, and our past hurts and frustrations. We're essentially saying to ourselves and to the world, this is all I can ever be, so why should I try to be anything else? But if, on the other hand, we choose to be prepared by the past, you and I are now acknowledging to the world what I may have experienced may not have been pleasant. It may not have been good, but the lessons I've learned and the skills I've developed as a result of going through that experience have prepared me for an even better, an even bigger, and an even greater future. So here's my question. Are you willing to go through the rest of your life saying, this is all I can ever be, so why try being anything else? Or have you thought about reframing the script and saying what I may have experienced may not have been pleasant, it may not have been good, but the lessons I learned in the process, the skills I developed as a result have prepared me for an even bigger, even better, even greater future. Now, the former says our history dictates our destiny. The latter statement promotes a positive, forward-looking mindset where our past forms a foundation for our future growth. And ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, everyone listening to the podcast today, guess what? It all comes down to a choice. We can choose to be free of the past, or we can choose to remain shackled to yesterday. You and I, we can choose to be defined by our past, or we can choose to be prepared by our past. So here's my thought as I get ready to wrap up today's teaching. Let me challenge you with this. Don't be a Nimrod who's fearful of the past. Don't be an oddfellow and refuse to get rid and address the skeletons in the closet. Let's you and I choose instead to unchain ourselves from the past. Let's choose to free ourselves from yesterday's pains and disappointments so that you and I can fully embrace today's opportunities and tomorrow's possibilities. Remember this, how we see ourselves matter. Our opinion of ourselves is what matters most. You and I, we can choose to be free of the past, or we can choose to remain shackled to yesterday. It's a choice, and we get to choose. You and I, we can choose to be defined by our past, or we can choose to be prepared by our past. So my question in closing is very, very simple. Which will you choose? To be defined by your past or prepared by your past? That decision, my friend, is up to you. I'm Dr. John Terry, the Black Belt Leader. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day.